welcome to the call.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We're just letting our guests come into the call. All right. I want to welcome everybody to the fifth edition of the Hyper Innovation Insight series. We're really delighted to have you join us today as we discuss a very important topic, public power, private ingenuity, innovating with government for scalable impact. My name is Charles Ojay, and I am the CEO of Hyper Group and your host today. I'm delighted to have two wonderful guests today with me. Both of them are women and well accomplished, and I am so proud to introduce them. I'm going to start with Ure, who is the technical advisor to the Minister of Innovation, Science and Technology in Nigeria. She leads many DFI engagements and international partnerships at the ministry. And she has co-designed and driven several high-impact national initiatives, including the Nigeria Clean Cooking Transition Program, the Presidential Bioenergy Value Chain Initiative, the ministry's AI Academy, which has registered over 250 Nigerians to date, young Nigerians to date. And she's also leading the thematic working group on smart agriculture, amongst many other things that she's doing. Uri, you seem to be extremely busy at the ministry. How are you today? And tell us what you're excited about today's topic as we dive into this webinar.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I made a comment that it was 250,000, which is,
yes.
I think we were all very surprised at the number, but quite ecstatic, and just thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited about this opportunity to speak about the shift that's happening within this space, and just to show some real tangible examples that I've been, very blessed to have witnessed and be a part of. I'm always a big fan of pushing positive narratives for Nigeria, so that's what I'm very excited about today.
Thanks a lot, Uri, and welcome again to the call. My second guest is a dear friend. We've worked together for many years during our time at GE. Chinedu was the senior commercial leader for Africa at GE Healthcare. She's calling in from New Jersey in the US. She was among the very early team. I will call it the team of two that kicked off GE Healthcare in West Africa way back, almost 20 years ago. Not that she is that old. As you can see from the pictures, she's still very young, but it's good to always start early. So she kicked it off in 2007 and has led diverse healthcare technology projects with governments across the continent, which is Africa. Chinedu, how are you today? And welcome to the call. And glad to hear about, why you're excited about this topic.
Thank you very much, Charles. Good morning, everyone. And Charles, are you trying to age me?
No, not at all.
No, I'm only pulling your legs. No, I look back on our early years, when we all came back home, with this incredible vision to be part of the transformation. And it's been a full circle journey with yourself and I, Charles. And I'm actually so blessed to be on this call and participate in this conversation. And I think prepping for this caused me to sort of reflect on what it was like then, all those years ago, compared to what the market is looking like now, and have we really made progress? So I'm hoping to answer that question at the end of this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chinedu. Welcome to the call. And like you said, it is a very interesting topic, and we have a lot to cover today in 60 minutes. And I believe we can get there. Just introducing today's story to our audience and those that eventually will be listening in. We do want to unpack a few global theoretical elements as it relates to partnering with government. However, we will most especially dive into the topic in terms of the practical applications, using Nigeria as a case reference in this case. And also, we'll probably extend that to Africa as well, but looking through the experience of our two wonderful guests as we talk about why partnership is important, what models are working, and how we can navigate this very challenging topic. I would like to also invite our audience to, if you have any questions, feel free to post your questions at any time during the webinar. I will be looking at the chat room from time to time, and I'll be, sharing your questions with our wonderful and esteemed um, guests. All right. Okay. So let's dive in. Let me paint a little bit of context here as it relates to government and partnerships. And I would say that this really goes back. Collaboration between the government and the private sector has existed for decades, if not centuries. The private sector has been an extended arm for solving problems in the world through innovation. An interesting example, was during World War II. At the time of the war, the U.S. government relied on research from academia. Well, interesting application, right, for development of new weapons, which was produced by the private sector. So as you can see from the right side of the slide, funding flows from government to research universities. These universities make discoveries that are eventually further developed by startups and then supported through funding from venture capital. Some innovations eventually scale into the marketplace as products and services. So in practice, there's a healthy mix of problems, policies, and as we can see, programs, including funding that help move the needle as it relates to solving problems within society. Development funding, as we know today, due to the new policies that we are seeing globally, these fundings from development institutions are drying up, especially for Africa and many parts of the world. However, private capital is still finding its way to attractive markets like Nigeria, for example. So I want to zero into Ure, and I want to ask, what does the situation look like in Nigeria? And when central policies and programs that are attractive to the private, what central policies and programs that are attractive to the private sector would you recommend for our audience to look at today?
Thank you so much. And I really like how you framed the slide and the question. And I think um, it's exactly the example that I'm going to give. And indeed, I think the Nigerian private sector in particular, has truly demonstrated remarkable resilience and capacity for innovation. I mean, you see this especially in the new fintech space, but you're seeing it more now across energy and agriculture, and in particular technology. And my take is this: we are undeniably in the midst of a global technology revolution, and it's been noted by pretty much every technology company's CEO that in 5 years the world is going to look completely different. And so for Nigeria to truly harness its potential, innovation must permeate all sectors. I think historically, research and development in Nigeria was considered more for, on the education sectors, and thinking about it more as an education, um, follow through. However, now what's happening is research and innovation is becoming very much top of mind for all of our
Mm-hmm.
leaders. So a powerful signal of this commitment is the newly inaugurated Interministerial Committee on Research and Innovation. And this committee comprises 14 ministers with the singular purpose of ensuring that sufficient funding and resources are strategically allocated to research and innovation across diverse sectors. Because very similar to what your slide shows, when there's sufficient funding and research allocation in those sectors, it trickles down into these innovative startups that can then be work hand in hand with government to create and have a private sector led innovation and commercialization strategy. So, for the audience, I urge you to look um, at this very closely in terms of innovation, because you know the policymakers are trying to find newer, efficient ways of getting tangible results and not it being business as usual. So, and innovation doesn't have to mean the latest in technology. It could just be a very small change based off of research that has been developed that can impact communities at a grand scale. So thinking more creatively, especially now that this environment has now shifted to have a bigger focus on research and innovation. The other thing that I'll say in addition to that is part of this committee is they're going to be able to pass the Research and Development Fund. And there's currently a plenary session with the president that's being planned, where the president will also give his statement on the importance of research and innovation. So this is where my focus has been, especially with the minister, is looking at partnerships that are strategic when it comes to how can we embed and make sure that there are programs and funding that can support these early startups, because a lot of times you do the research and innovation, but then you don't have the support for the startups to even get off the ground. So that has been a lot of our strategy the last years, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that as we continue the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Ure. It is very refreshing to hear and see that the government is really looking at research and innovation critically, because this is the bedrock for many developed societies. And not just looking at research and development or research and innovation, but looking at how do we fund research in Nigeria. And this is really very encouraging to hear. The beautiful thing about this call is we have you sitting on the public sector, seat, and we have Chinedu sitting on the private sector seat. So I'm going to turn the table to Chinedu on the private sector side. And being that, from what I hear from you, Ure, there is this appetite from government, the Nigerian government, to partner with the private sector and solve, complex problems and see how best to, unlock new markets, unlock funding, and create this social economic prosperity for their citizens. And when we look at public innovation, we see this triangle of collaboration, right? We see government on one hand, we see the private sector, in this case, industry, on another hand. But there's also a very interesting element that is kind of like in the middle when you look at public innovation, which is academia. A player that we are yet to deeply, explore in Nigeria. And I want to talk to Chinedu for at this time. Chinedu, looking at what we see on the ground in markets like Nigeria, the private sector normally takes the lead in solving a problem. They work so hard, they overcome the hurdles, they advance with resilience until hopefully they succeed. especially in the area of things like technology utilization across sectors like finance. We've seen beautiful fintechs that have risen from the ashes. Agriculture, energy. What's your take on this behavior and movement of the private sector in the space of innovation?
Thank you, Charles, for contextualizing this specific section of the conversation. Um, I am going to try really hard to remain as pragmatic as possible, particularly with my views based on my experience working not only in the Nigerian market in sub-Saharan Africa, but across Africa, really. And then also try to dissociate from comparing with other markets that I've also worked in, being more mature markets. And the reason for that distinction is that, we have to remain within context to be able to give a fair analysis and also give a fair forecast of what the potential future could look like for markets like Nigeria. Now, I want to thank Ure for giving us some insights into what the government is doing, how they are sort of posturing for the future. It's always exciting to hear about, bold steps coming out from the seat of government. But we also have to take into consideration the environment that Nigerian entrepreneurs work in. Charles, you mentioned, earlier that um, the norm seems to be that the private sector leads the charge. They make something out of nothing, and in so doing, they entice the government to come along. You said something rising from the ashes, and my immediate thought was, well, why does it have to be ashes though? Why
Mhm.
why can't we be rising from the rainbows? And it is what it is. So one of the things that I like to, challenge people that I get into this conversation with is it's incredibly um it's incredibly judicious to take these bold steps towards catching up with the rest of the world, revisit of how we fund research, development, technology, etc. But all of that can only succeed in an ecosystem that enables the effectiveness. And so what does that look like? We train folks on how to go through school, how to study, apply themselves. But what's that environment like for them, where there's hardly electricity, where there are basic infrastructure gaps that impact how they learn? Yes, we've built resilience in the private sector, but after a while, that resilience can begin to wane because when
Mhm.
we look at the rest of the world, or maybe not even the rest of the world, the rest of, let's just look at Pan-Africa. We look at some other countries and we see, but, they don't have to exist in these harsh conditions. And then we have the challenges of our manpower, our intellectual property exiting, for greener pastures. So I think the conversation has to also include what are these structural infrastructural barriers that still exist that if we can figure out how to address, it would further accelerate these advances that the government, now refocusing on and help us close enormous gaps in meeting up with global needs, global demands, so that we can remain competitive on the global stage, not just as a country, but particularly as our citizens. So academia is critical. It's usually where bright sparks begin. And many of the incredible innovations of our generation and even, one or two generations prior, Charles, as you noted, started in the space of academia. But then those bright sparks need to be incubated in sustainable environments to grow so that we can move beyond piloting ideas to actually scaling these ideas and innovations for impact. So I want to
Yeah, thanks,
emphasize
Jolie.
I want to emphasize, very specifically that we cannot have a conversation without talking about structural barriers and challenges that still exist. And these are very notable barriers. When we think about, roads, how do we access some of these services? When we think about power, electricity, how do we power, you know, these services? When we think about education, is the populace educated well enough to be able to, access or utilize effectively these innovations that we're talking about? Sustainability, long-term visioning, long-term planning. How do we move beyond the budget cycle and move towards 25, 30-year, structural planning for the country or for a state or for local government, etc.? How do we resource these future plans? So how does that influence what we are teaching in academia? What sort of research is being funded, etc.? All of these are part of the value chain that would really determine how effective and sustainable these initial innovations that we're looking to invest in will be, not only for the current generation, but for future generations. And that's really where I believe, we have to be focused on. If we've missed the mark for now, we have to plan aggressively for the future.
Very, very interesting comments, Chinedu. And as you were talking, I was just, thinking about, the private sector being very willing and interested in developing projects, commercializing projects, but it's almost like there's a rope. It's almost like when you're in the environment, there's a rope around your neck, or there's a load on your leg that doesn't allow you to move at
Mhm.
the speed and the pace that you want to take. And creating an enabling environment is always the core function of government. And a
Mhm.
lot of times there are various conceptions that private sector innovators might have. And I want to agree that everyone is, everyone holds on to their opinions. However, government may be doing some things or may not be doing some things. And I want to turn to Ure as we discuss more about this enabling environment and the different initiatives that the government is trying to put in place. Looking at public innovation and looking at different types of programs and policies that the government is trying to put in place. I mean, in other markets, there are different types of models, whether you're talking about civic tech, whether you're talking about open data initiatives, where you're talking about digital infrastructure. But Chinedu, you also mentioned something about how do we go beyond research and piloting? Like, how do we go beyond, creating a market where we are just consumers into becoming producers? And I want to, turn to Ure to Ure. Can you tell us more about some of the programs and policies? I knew I stole three zeros from you earlier on when we talked about the 250. It's 250,000, which is one of. I want to apologize for stealing three zeros, but now I want to
Yes.
give you back the table. And I want you to talk about some of the programs and the policies that the government is putting in place to create this enabling environment for we private sector players to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to definitely just, plus one to Chinedu's comment earlier about ensuring there's an enabling environment and the proper infrastructure for these programs to thrive. And, I think that was one of the the pills that I had to swallow coming from New York back to Nigeria. Was like there's basic needs that people have to have first before they can get these programs even to them. So this is one of the reasons why people like my minister have people like me who've been abroad on his team, and I've seen that across the vice president's office, the president's office, and some other advisors who, I mean, these people are incredibly educated and have just vast amount of experience and are truly working to ensure that these things, they're pushing the needles within the constraints that they have, to ensure that the policies do reflect the need for power, the need for clean water, and the need for digital access. So these conversations are definitely being had. Because it's a huge governmental system, everyone obviously has their way of doing things. But I will definitely say, as a witness, that everyone is definitely, people who I work with at least, are definitely thinking the same thing. And in terms of some of the existing programs, I've been lucky enough to be have seen this coming from literally the ground up within our ministry. We have 17 agencies, and agriculture, raw materials, biotechnology, energy. One example is with our Raw Materials Research and Development Council. There is a legislative bill that will have a 30% value addition built into exports or products, I'm sorry, before export, particularly in agriculture, which is a huge game changer. Because if you look at um, some of these raw materials like cocoa, chocolate, I mean, cocoa into chocolate, or cotton into textiles, or cassava. You just see how much Nigeria is losing out on the potential that there is there within the natural resources that we have, and for that to be turned into local processing. And if you look at countries like Bangladesh, they have $47 billion in annual textile exports from cotton. Vietnam, $40 billion. I think even Turkey was around that figure, around 30 or $40 billion. And what tends to happen is, a lot of countries will come to Nigeria and take our raw materials. They'll process it in their country and then sell the products back to us. So that DG has been doing a lot of work around that value addition bill. Um, the other is the Energy Commission of Nigeria. That DG is also doing a lot of work. There's a renewable energy localization bill, which is a proposed bill for solar panel manufacturing in Nigeria. Um, which, because obviously we import a lot of our solar products. I mean, he definitely has a big challenge in front of him, because we're competing with China, and when it comes to solar, I think the bottom line for a lot of these things is costs. But there is opportunity that lies in localizing that entire value chain. Component manufacturing to assembly, to the energy deficit, and create green jobs, and position Nigeria as a regional hub for renewable energy solutions. So he's been doing a lot of work around that. And he's also been engaging with a number of different countries. I've been with him and the minister to Germany, to China, and working on one of the policies on green hydrogen that we've been working on with GIZ in Germany. And this will also create an enabling environment, which will build the market demand for green hydrogen across not only Nigeria, but also in Europe, because green hydrogen processing, a lot of the products can produce not only green hydrogen, but oxygen. Then you have other colors, I should say, and forms of hydrogen. So there's a lot of potential in the renewable energy space that the DG has been working very hard on. Another policy that I would say that will have a very big impact in Nigeria in the coming months is obviously the carbon market activation plan and policy, which I believe is in the final stages. And this would create I mean, significant opportunities for the private sector in clean energy, going back to the green industrial hubs and spaces, because it will be supported by this new blended finance mechanism and a national carbon registry that will be aligned to international standards. We hosted a Commonwealth Roundtable in February with the Commonwealth in London, was specifically on creative and strategies for climate resilient agriculture. And the big topic was on carbon markets. And we're working with a company now on the securitization of carbon, which basically is
We're losing you for a minute for some seconds, Ure. Are you there? I think you're breaking up a bit.
When you think about how these policies can enable the financing that goes beyond the traditional DFI and banking structure. And I'll mention, I mean, like I said, we have 17 agencies, so there's quite a bit. But I think the other one that's really important that is tying into the research and development is our work with FCDO. We have a project called Sankore, and that project is specifically to create a structure on how to go from research and development into commercialization. What are the steps that are strategies that could be formulated to ensure there's a bit of a smoother process that doesn't have as many bottlenecks. And so we're aiming to launch between 3 to 5 products. There's also been within that program, there was an innovation fund through Bank of Industry that was announced. And it's a fund that's supposed to be supporting this process and supporting the startup entrepreneurs who are in this space, and to open the doors for private sectors to partner with academia and research institutions to help de-risk these new technologies and commercialize innovations that address local needs and global markets. So, I think the common thread between all these things is that we have to think more creatively and thinking a bit more outside the box of how to, transition into this new environment, with renewable energy, carbon credits, how to empower our people and ourselves of especially the young generation. I saw it. I mean, my father's from Abia, and we were in the village for our holidays, and so many young people they just have so much time on their hands. They just need to know what to do. So these will create opportunities, and then of course, we talked about the AI Academy. So technology skilling and upskilling is also quite important as well. So I think those are the ones that are top of mind.
Thank you so much, Ure. And it looks and really feels like there are a lot of initiatives happening on the government side. In short, as I listen to you, I almost feel like upgrading the topic and the title of the webinar to, from innovating with government to engaging and innovating with government. Because one of the things that I'm learning from what you're saying is that there's a lot happening, and we as private sector, we need to find a way to one scan and understand what the priorities of government are, how it fits with what we are trying to do, and then figure out the best way to engage. And from an engagement standpoint, I want to turn to Chinedu. And Chinedu, you have a lot of experience over the years, good, bad, and ugly, around engaging with government. And Uri has talked about a bunch of things, wonderful initiatives that are happening on the government side. But we know that navigating that space, especially from a private sector point of view, is not always easy. From your experience, what makes innovating with government successful, and especially, how do we approach engaging with government from a private sector lens? What are your thoughts?
Sure, Charles. Thank you for that. I think there are a couple of things to sort of establish before we even delve into that.
Hmm.
Now, I'm speaking as someone who's worked, for a private entity. So the first question one should ask is who's the end user, who's the customer, who's the client? And the client in relation to what the product or the service that we are selling are. And so in our case, our end users were, I worked in medical technology, so our end users were healthcare professionals and then ultimately patients. The impact of our goods and services were to really move the needle as it related to patient care. So that's where we start from. And and then we start to ask ourselves, well, do we share these end users or patients with other parties? And of course, the government being one, when we think about public health, and then in the private sector, private practitioners, being another. Now, that understanding helps us frame the nature of engagement. Because in a sense, the government is a vehicle for change. Um, and so they are stakeholders, not necessarily, the end user or the ultimate customer. So they are stakeholders. Now, where there's funding input from the government, then they become a type of client. And that would, again, influence the nature of the engagement. But for this particular conversation, I think my understanding is really focusing on the partnership with the government to help deliver impact for patients, constituents, the population. So
Yes.
understanding that it's a partnership, then it's to define, well, what are the terms of this partnership to enable everybody's goals or majority of each party's goals to be met. Now, getting clarity on that will then shape the nature of our engagement before we even start to think about what are the needs, what are the parastatals, what are the policies, etc. Once we understand that, then the goal will be, well, we want to establish a partnership to help address a shared goal. Once that partnership is established, then the next step is really now trying to understand, well, what is the framework for this partnership going to look like? And who are the various, levers? Who are the decision makers? What policies are in place that will enable this partnership deliver on its mandate? Is there funding required? How can we go together to secure funding? Who's in your network that we can leverage, etc. Then all these questions, come into play. But the guiding principle is always, what are we coming together to solve for? And the solution that this partnership is going to come up with, how is it going to help meet your goals and my goals? Um, it's been very important to sort of use that approach, particularly, on the continent, because our governments want to be, I hate using this term, but carried along. Um, they want to be involved in the decision making. They want to demonstrate vested interest because they want to own the end goal, the end result. And we share that as well. So that sort of co-creation, co-collaboration from inception to strategizing to executing and then to, the fireworks when we have hit the mark, they need to be part of that entire value chain. So that's how we sort of drove engagement back then, and I believe to a very large extent it's still sort of the framework used now. But if there isn't that sort of nitty-gritty understanding and we are locking hands on this from start to finish, it's very easy to sort of get sidetracked or or lose necessary information that would help with a successful execution. That's been my experience. But thinking about, right now, in this current era of our markets, and I'm not just speaking about, emerging markets or, markets like Nigeria, but just, globally, there is a shift that has taken place where the private sector is leading the charge now, and governments are now sort of playing catch up, where a private sector entity will identify the problem, or maybe even reimagine the problem, and reiterate a solution, and test and pivot and figure out what tools are required and go to market and, establish success and then report out and then get the attention of the government. It doesn't always work that, like that, but particularly in certain settings, like Charles, you mentioned earlier, in the space of fintech, in ed tech, in a lot of these, like, tech solutions. Not everything requires tech, though, but I'm using these as examples. We've seen the private sector sort of, be bullish about their approach to solving these issues. It even started way, way back in the telco era, where telecoms was just this space where the government didn't quite know how to formulate its solution, and the likes of MTNs, etc., led the way. But it was important to carry the government along to get their buy-in so that when success, when we hit the gold mine, the government felt they had vested interest. So co-creation, collaboration, maybe not co-execution because the
Mhm.
private sector usually leads on that. Um, but but definitely the co-ownership of the value process, of the value chain, has been critical to success for a lot of our endeavors on the continent.
Wow, thanks a lot, Chinido. And your comments are really getting me thinking, and I really like how you paint this picture of the foundational requirements for engagement. And you've mentioned two very important things that I'm kind of taking notes on, and I even for me personally is a big takeaway. One is, building shared value, or let me call it shared goal formation with the government. Like, how do we come to a point of alignment around the outcomes we are trying to create?
Mhm.
Because in many times, in many cases, government is sitting almost as a gatekeeper. I have one of my mentors said, for markets like Nigeria, when you are trying to connect to a large base of consumers, there are three interesting, or if not four interesting gatekeepers that are people that if once you access them, you can access the entire market. It's the banks because they have a huge consumer or customer base. Like if you have a product and you drop it in a bank and the bank says, I'm going to take it to my customer base, that's huge. All right. You have the telcos, you mentioned them, right? The telcos are sitting on, MTN alone, I think it's about 80 million of subscribers that they have. All right. That's a big, customer base. And as a result, they are almost like a doorway into the market. Another the third interesting gatekeeper is government, because government is connected with citizens and is, shaping and in some cases protecting and serving its citizens. And as a private sector player, sometimes in certain sectors, you have to, go through government. Like in healthcare, for example, you mentioned, the patient. Health in some cases for us in Nigeria is a public good. So going through government is very critical. So I want to ask you, when you look at this foundational thing of shared goals forming that shared goals? Do you have any practical approaches for we private sector players? Like, how do we, how do we, how do we get to a point where we have goals that are mutually aligned with our government stakeholders?
That's a great question, Charles. And as you were speaking, like two examples popped up in my head. You were involved in one. But I'll speak more generally. Now, one of the things we used to do a lot of was spend quite a bit of time in Abuja, really just familiarizing ourselves with not just, our ministry, but really just trying to understand what what is being talked about the most. What is influencing the purse strings? So I'll give an example. Now, as you know, in most of sub-Saharan Africa, healthcare budgets were heavily reliant on foreign aid, and most of the funding coming in from aid was used to fund many of the pilot projects, etc. Capital expenditure was from the budget. And so what did that look like, or what did that mean? That meant that there were a number of programs that were going to impact human lives that were solely going to be funded by aid coming in. So there was naturally always going to be a deficit. There was naturally always going to never be a scale, a program at scale that was going to be deployed because aid funds were, not infinite. And so one of the things we spent a lot of time trying to understand were what were the numbers that were critical to our governance. So, for example, if the health minister should communicate, or we want to reduce infant mortality by X because WHO has said we have to, and it's a requirement for, the MDGs or the SDGs. We are working to do this. And these are the programs that are going to help us do these. And we go and assess, well, what are these programs doing? How are they funded? What are the gaps? That's the opportunity. And so we frame our solution around helping the government to meet those goals that have been publicized, communicated. And we go back and we think, is there a solution we already have that can help them meet these goals and maybe even exceed these goals? Do we have to re-engineer the solution? Is it a function of technology? Is it a function of human resource development? Is it a function of process improvement? Is it a function of financing or funding? Or do they need like better partners to help them do better what they're already doing? So those are some of the questions that we would ask. And a lot of times we already had some of these solutions in our toolkit and we just needed to repurpose them. And so there is the co-creation opportunity. So we come back to the government and say, look, we've done this in other markets, and they've shown good results. And we reckon that we could demonstrate similar results, if not better, if we reconstitute this or repurpose this for your market. Are you interested? Let's rub minds together and let's build something out of what we have. Let's look at what's already on ground, what's already been funded. Let's figure out how to maybe refinance or, retool, etc. And that, for the most part, worked. Now, it could take some time because, as you know, doing anything with government, there's bureaucracy to go through. So we also had to sort of create a buffer to understand that our urgency may not be their urgency. We work in quarterly cycles, governments work in annual cycles. So how do we fit, our urgency into their plan? How do we figure out how to encourage them to outsource some of these technical requirements to us so that we can do it, quicker, better, just get faster results, etc. And it was a constant sort of give and take, ebb and flow, a constant revisiting of the process. Do we need to change here? Do we need to pivot? Do we need to stop? Do we need to move faster, etc.? But hand in hand. Now, goals also are subject to change. That was something
Mm-hmm.
that we also had to understand. A minister could be could be unseated. There could be a new direction from, from the top. Funding could drive whatever. And so we also understood that we were subject, our goals were subject to change. But even with that, you build all those risks into, like, your project plan and figure out how to mitigate against them. But it was heavily important to be as proactive as possible as opposed to reactive. So those are some of, like, the takeaways that I would share without sort of giving actual examples, but those are some of the key things that we were constantly trying to, to work with as we engaged with the different governments on the continent.
Wow. It's so eye-opening because it's almost like we also, our perception of government, it almost like shifts from being from a funder or environment enabler to almost like a customer. How you build a
Absolutely.
product, how you build a product for an end customer. You really want to find out what are their pain points, what exactly are their needs, what are the things that they are trying to achieve, and then from there you now begin to tailor and see how does my solution or how does my program or how does my offering or how does my company fit with that government mandate. How do
Absolutely.
we align, and then we then take it from there. This is really truly insightful, and time will not permit me to. I have a bunch of more full-on questions for you. I mean, one of which is, do you also do like capacity development in trying to get the government on board and co-align with them? I assume, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Charles, I'll give you an example, and this I think would be also for the benefit of the audience. Um, we had a technology. When I say we, this was GE. When I was with GE, we had a technology that had done amazingly well in another market, in an Asian market, similar sort of settings with the Nigerian market, and we thought we can replicate this success in sub-Saharan Africa. We approached the government, and the government said we don't need tech. Babies are dying, and it's not because there's a lack of tech. There's just a lack of trained or skilled personnel to meet them at the point of need. And we, this is a technology company. We don't do training. We don't do, I mean, we train technicians to use our technology, but we do not train, other clinical staff in that way. And so we had to go back and think, okay, we don't do this, but do we know people that do this well? And can we partner with them? And the idea was that if we're able to train a whole bunch of midwives to be able to carry out life-saving services at the point of care in the communities, will that encourage the government to buy our technology to equip these midwives with? And that creates a pipeline for us to sell our technology into. This was a question we asked, but we had to test it somehow. And so we managed to get the government somewhat interested. We spoke with bilateral and multilateral partners. Some of them were, curious about could this work? We piloted, we got some good results, and we're able to secure a contract with the government to deploy capacity development trainings across the nation in the 6 geopolitical zones. And
Wow.
on the back end of that was, purchase of our technology to equip the midwives with.
Interesting.
Now, this started from wanting to sell technology, but the customer said, we don't need tech. We want to train our personnel. But eventually, the need for tech was created when the personnel was trained and needed tech to fully deploy their skill sets, in the settings that they were working in. So sometimes you start with an end goal in mind, but from understanding your client's pain points, understanding also the environment you're trying to sell into, you might need to repurpose, or maybe even introduce a completely new paradigm that didn't exist in your portfolio before. But that way you're able to meet the client's need and then encourage them to explore other things that you may have to deliver.
Oh, thank you. This is truly the essence of innovation. Thank you so much, Chinedo. And as we come to we're getting to the end of the webinar, and I have one more question for Ure, especially as we've heard from Chinedu around from the private sector lens, a model or an approach to engaging with government. I would love to hear, from the public sector side and yourself, Ure, your own perception or your own thoughts around how the private how the private sector should engage with government, especially as there are many things the government is doing and trying to put in place to create that enabling environment. How would you recommend our audience and eventually innovators from the private sector to engage? What steps would you recommend they take as they look at engaging with government, looking at it from a public sector lens now?
Yeah, listening to Chineda, I think a lot of what she said definitely resonated, and it's similar to my experience both from the private sector and then on the government side, where I think there could be a mutual ground for effective engagement. Um, the first is problem centric clarity and policy mapping. It's like, before anything else, be crystal clear about what exactly you're trying to solve. Like, what's the problem that you're aiming to solve, and its alignment with national priorities. I've sat on so many proposal meetings where they're just going on and on and on, and like, you can tell that they haven't done their research to try to map it to our agents specifically, or some of the national priorities, or even local, like pilot phase, like what local community are you engaging, even down to sometimes the community leaders, because you need a lot of the buy-in from some of these community leaders to even do any of these programs. So meticulously mapping that landscape, the policy landscape, which ministries, which departments, which agencies already have this mandate in place, or what existing policies or programs can be leveraged instead of you trying to create a brand new one. Having very concise, compelling notes. My minister doesn't like a lot of long explanations. Like, he just likes very short, concise. And I've noticed a lot of ministers are the same, just because they have so much going on in their heads. They just like to get straight to the point. Um, Also, has your proposal, does it have a proof of concept, or is this just something that has been studied? If it doesn't, if it's just a study, what have you done to do risk your project? What is the data? What's the data validation that has built credibility for this? These will make the solutions more attractive, and especially if you've even done more research on, let's say, if financing is needed, if you have partners engaged, like similar to what Chinedu had said, you already have partners in place. So basically, you're coming in with something that's nicely packaged, that government can then, using the scale and policy, regulatory, and convening power that government has, to amplify it, and that will create a much faster process, especially because if it's to that stage. I mean, I've seen, I witnessed where the company will just they'll be speaking with the president like in 2 weeks. I mean, that it's to that level. Um, then the second that I would say, definitely, is educating and co-creating. I mean, I did this in my last role in government affairs at Google. We did so much on education because we knew the product, we knew the latest and the greatest, and government, they would, obviously government stakeholders are too busy to learn about every nuance about your product. Um, and they might not immediately grasp, the innovative solution addressing. So you have to really educate them on your solution or your product, because that way they can then, understand it from their perspective, and then look at it as, oh, okay, this is actually going to solve this problem. So education is very, very big. And also investing time in building relationships, and you know uh, because that really will help, with that relationship being your anchor within that institution, and essentially doing some type of lobbying for you, because your priorities and objectives, and can really play a catalytic role, in making sure that your solution is in the forefront for, let's say, if there's now funding, yours would be the first or amongst the top that are being selected as one of the solution providers. So, um, and the co-creation also goes, in line with the policy. Going back to the Google example, Google co-created the AI policy, with the Ministry of Communication, and the green hydrogen policy that I mentioned earlier. We're co-creating that, with GIZ. Um, so co-creation, it helps to foster, trust and mutual understanding, and making sure that, again, that enabling environment is set in place, because the private sector has, the latest in terms of what environment would they need for it to be successful. So they need to make sure that that is infused in, the policy. I mean, this is also happening. We have a space agency in our ministry, and there's obviously been a lot of interest in the space sector. So now the private sector is working with this our space agency DG to essentially like re-edit the policy, because there's now a lot of interest in, basically purchasing space in space. So it's the times are really changing. So the private sector is co-creating that with, our space agency. And then the last one that I think is also very key, and it's something that, I'm experiencing now, is thinking long term and beyond administration cycles. I mean, in the last like month, everyone has been telling me, "Oh, just get ready for next year. Wait till next year," because it's election season is going to start, and everyone keeps saying that. And I'm like, "Oh my goodness!" So I'm just bracing myself, because everyone's been telling me. But it's one of the biggest challenges, and it is this kind of short term government planning, because government is always looking at, oh my God, I have XYZ time to do XYZ. So as private sector, you have to think in decades and not just terms. And like, okay, it's like, how do you build, this that can go beyond that leader? Because even for someone like
Mhm,
myself, I have a short cycle, because if my
mhm,
minister leaves, I will leave. I'm not a government employee.
mhm.
So, so you have to advocate for policies that can transcend administrations. I mean, Charles, you and I have talked about this too,
Yes.
about things that happened, with some of the projects that you worked on, and like what's happened to them now, And so, your long-term commitment is like the most powerful signal you can send to secure sustained government buy-in and support, because then they'll be like, oh, okay, um, this can last even when I'm not a minister. Like, okay, great, or this can last if I'm not, a vice president or governor. Um, because a lot of people are thinking like, okay, like how can we get like short term wins? Like now we're in the middle of this, planning for clean cooking, and I when I'm getting feedback from some of the people in the community, they're like, oh, they sent 10,000 stoves and we didn't do anything with them. They just sat there. So it's like, okay, how do you think about how to make sure that the community is engaged to actually adopt the solution, than just dumping a bunch of things in communities and expecting people to just, accept it. So those are, the three things that I'll say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ure. We have come to the end of the hour and we are wrapping up the webinar now. And I want to just ask for some, closing remarks as we proceed. Chinedo, any closing remarks that you may have as we wrap up the call?
Sure. I think, and this is specifically about, our market in Nigeria. There are challenges. These challenges have existed for a long while, and we know that the government's working hard to address these challenges, but it hasn't deterred the likes of the incredible companies that have come out of that country. So if anything, I would say, for innovators who are looking to markets like Nigeria, be bullish, be clear about the solution, be clear also about the environment and what it would take to succeed, and go get everything and everyone you need to make it happen. The successes are there to be had, and it is the risk takers, the the resilient risk takers that would take advantage of all that that market has to offer. So be bullish and do not be deterred. Success is waiting, and Nigeria is also getting ready for its next phase.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chinedo. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Ure, any final thoughts and comments for our audience?
Um, yeah, I mean, I truly believe that the future of Nigeria, is going to be shaped by intentional, um, strategic collaboration, between the private sector and the government. You have to have both coming together, and um, I think that for me, I always think of every morning. I think of the North Star. What the future could look like, and using that as an anchor. As I'm dredging through, the day to day, is like the North Star, the bigger picture of like, this is what success could look like. Um, and so, moving beyond the narratives of skepticism, and really embracing this new era, because I think that the world is changing. So there's so much opportunity that's in front of us, that if finding the right people that can work together, it can just unlock so much potential. And I'm really confident, and I have a lot of faith in our young generation, because they're the ones who are going to really be pushing a lot of these new ideas that our parents would never even think was possible. So I have a lot of faith and hope, in the future generation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ure. Thank you so much, Chinedo. What an exciting hour we've had. Truly, truly informative. I wish we could go on there's still, I think this conversation is something we need to continue to have. I want to encourage our audience. We have this, we will be sharing the slides in our WhatsApp community. So please feel free to just scan the barcode and join the community. We'll be sharing the slides there. We'll also be sharing the recording on our various channels. We're really very grateful for you joining us today and taking time out of your busy afternoon to listen into this session. Big thank you to our two guests, Ms. Ure and Ms. Chinedo, for sharing their thoughts and experience around this very interesting topic of innovating with government. We believe that building a prosperous society is a journey. that requires the collective effort of all stakeholders to solve big problems. The world needs innovation leaders like you, and you need problem solvers like us here at HYBA. And we're open to have conversations with you should you choose to explore any big problem in the future that you want to solve. We are open to partnering with you and helping you go through the journey, even navigating with government. So again, I want to say a big thank you to our guests and a big thank you to everyone that has joined the call. Thank you very much for your time, and do have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever part of the world you are in. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you for having us, Charles. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ure. Thanks, Chinedo.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. All right. Bye.